Obito Uchiha spent most of his life trying to escape a single moment. Not a battle, not a war, not a defeat. A moment. A few seconds that shattered everything he believed about the world and transformed one of Naruto's most hopeful characters into one of its most dangerous villains. What makes Obito fascinating is that, unlike many villains, he did not begin his journey with darkness already inside him. He was not cruel as a child. He was not obsessed with power. He did not dream about revenge. In fact, if you look at the young Obito, without knowing where his story eventually leads, he feels far more like a future hero than a future villain. He was emotional, compassionate, stubbornly optimistic, and determined to help others even when he struggled himself. In many ways, he was surprisingly similar to Naruto. He wasn't considered a genius within the Uchiha clan. He wasn't naturally gifted like Kakashi, and he certainly wasn't the kind of prodigy that people expected to accomplish great things effortlessly. He made mistakes. He trained hard just to keep pace with others. More often than not, he found himself being compared to people who seemed better than him at almost everything. Yet, despite those frustrations, Obito possessed something many talented shinobi lacked. He believed in people. He believed hard work mattered. He believed friendship mattered. He believed the future could be better than the present. Most importantly, he believed that kindness was not weakness. These beliefs shaped nearly every part of his personality. His dream of becoming Hokage was not really about authority or status. Like Naruto after him, Obito wanted acknowledgement. He wanted to prove that someone ordinary could become extraordinary through determination and heart. He wanted people to see value in him. At the center of that dream stood two people who would define his life. The first was Kakashi Hatake, his teammate, rival, and constant source of frustration. Kakashi represented everything Obito wished he could be. Calm under pressure, naturally talented, respected by others. Every success Kakashi achieved seemed to remind Obito of how far he still had to go. Yet beneath the rivalry was genuine admiration. Over time, that admiration slowly grew into friendship. The second was Rin Nohara. It would be easy to describe Rin simply as Obito's childhood crush, but her importance ran much deeper than that. Rin became connected to nearly every hope he carried. When Obito imagined becoming stronger, protecting his friends, earning recognition, and eventually becoming Hokage, Rin was always part of that future. She represented encouragement, acceptance, and the belief that he could become someone better than he was. Looking back, one of the most tragic aspects of Obito's story is how close he actually came to achieving happiness. Unlike many villains, whose dreams were always impossible, Obito's goals were surprisingly realistic. He had friends. He was improving as a shinobi. His relationships were growing stronger. The future seemed uncertain, but it felt attainable. There was a path ahead of him, and for the first time in his life, it seemed to be leading somewhere meaningful. Then war intervened. Naruto's world is filled with children forced to carry burdens that should belong to adults. Entire generations are thrown into conflicts they never created, expected to kill and die before they fully understand the reasons behind the fighting. Obito, Kakashi, and Rin were no different. During a mission in the Third Great Ninja War, a collapsing cave trapped Obito beneath a massive boulder. The injury appeared fatal. Escape was impossible. Death seemed inevitable. What happened next reveals everything about who Obito originally was. Knowing he was likely about to die, he did not become angry. He did not blame Kakashi. He did not curse the world. Instead, he gave Kakashi his Sharingan as a gift. Even in what appeared to be his final moments, his thoughts centered on the people he cared about. He wanted Kakashi to survive. He wanted Rin to be protected. He wanted his friends to continue moving forward. That version of Obito is important to remember, because later, when he commits terrible acts, it becomes easy to forget who he once was. Everyone believed Obito died beneath that boulder. But fate had other plans. Instead of dying, he was rescued by Madara Uchiha, a legendary shinobi whose view of the world could not have been more different from Obito's. While recovering from his injuries, Obito spent months listening to Madara explain why humanity was doomed to repeat cycles of suffering forever. According to Madara, pain was unavoidable. Conflict was inevitable. People would always betray one another. The world itself was fundamentally broken. What is fascinating is that Obito initially rejected all of it. He argued constantly. He defended humanity. He insisted that people could understand each other. He insisted that bonds mattered. He insisted that there was still hope. For months, Madara's philosophy failed to convince him. And this is where many people misunderstand Obito's transformation. Madara did not manipulate him with clever speeches. Madara did not brainwash him. Instead, reality eventually delivered the argument for him. When Obito finally escaped and rushed toward the battlefield to reunite with Kakashi and Rin, he carried months of anticipation with him. He was going to see his friends again. He was going to return home. He was going to continue the life that had been interrupted. Then he arrived at the worst possible moment. Rin was dead, and Kakashi was standing over her. The scene remains one of the most devastating moments in Naruto because it destroys far more than a relationship. It destroys an entire world view. Many people simplify Obito's story by saying he started a war because a girl died. But that explanation misses the true tragedy completely. Rin was not merely someone he loved. She was the symbol holding together everything he believed about life. Her death seemed to prove that friendship could fail, that good intentions could fail, that hope could fail, that the future could disappear without warning, no matter how hard someone fought to protect it. Standing there in the rain, surrounded by death and chaos, Obito reached a conclusion that would define the rest of his life. The problem was not Kakashi. The problem was not the hidden mist. The problem was not any single person. The problem was reality itself. From that point forward, Obito stopped believing the world could be fixed. Instead, he became convinced it needed to be replaced. The infinite Tsukuyomi was born from this belief. A dream world where nobody suffered, nobody lost loved ones, nobody experienced loneliness, nobody had to endure the kind of pain that had destroyed him. And that is what makes Obito such a compelling villain. At his core, he never stopped wanting peace. He never stopped wanting happiness. He never stopped wanting a better world. The tragedy is that he eventually lost faith in humanity's ability to create that world naturally. So instead, he decided to force it into existence, no matter how many lives had to be sacrificed along the way. Because once Obito convinced himself that reality was the enemy, every terrible decision afterward became easier to justify. And the hopeful boy, who once dreamed of becoming Hokage, slowly disappeared behind a mask, spending years trying to build a perfect dream world because he could no longer bear living in the real one. Nagato did not choose his path because he wanted power. He chose it because he became convinced that peace was impossible. That distinction is important because, unlike many villains, Nagato never stops chasing peace. Even after founding the Akatsuki, even after destroying entire villages, even after becoming one of the most feared men in the shinobi world, his goal remains remarkably similar to the dream he carried as a child. The tragedy is that every lesson life taught him pushed him further away from achieving it. When people think about pain, they often picture the orange-haired figure standing above the Hidden Leaf village after its destruction, speaking calmly about pain while entire buildings crumble beneath him. He feels almost godlike in those moments, distant from ordinary human emotions and completely certain of his beliefs. Yet long before he became pain, before the Akatsuki, and before the Rinnegan became known throughout the world, Nagato was simply a frightened child trying to survive in one of the worst places imaginable. He was born in the Hidden Rain village, a nation trapped between larger powers and constantly scarred by war. While the great villages fought for influence and territory, places like the Rain often became battlefields where ordinary people suffered the consequences. Entire generations grew up surrounded by violence they had no control over. Homes were destroyed. Families disappeared. Children learned fear long before they learned peace. Nagato's earliest memories were shaped by this reality. Unlike Naruto, who dreamed of becoming Hokage from within a relatively stable village, Nagato grew up witnessing the consequences of the shinobi system itself. He saw what happened to the people caught underneath the ambitions of powerful nations. He experienced firsthand how easily innocent lives could be sacrificed in conflicts they never chose. One day, that suffering became personal. When Konoha Shinobi entered his family's home. During the chaos of war, a misunderstanding led them to believe Nagato's parents were enemies. They killed them almost instantly. For the shinobi, it was a mistake made during a confusing and dangerous situation. For Nagato, it was the moment his childhood ended. The image is difficult to forget. A young boy watching his parents die in front of him, powerless to stop it, unable to understand why it happened. The people responsible were not monsters. They were not evil men laughing as they committed atrocities. They were soldiers. They were doing what war had trained them to do. That realization would become one of the foundations of Nagato's worldview. Because if good people could commit terrible acts simply because circumstances demanded it, then perhaps the problem was larger than any individual person. After losing his parents, Nagato wandered through a devastated world alone until he eventually met two other orphans, Yahiko and Konan. This meeting changed everything. For the first time since his parents' deaths, Nagato found something resembling hope. The three children formed a bond stronger than friendship. They became family. Together, they survived starvation, war, and uncertainty. They dreamed about creating a better future, despite having every reason to abandon such dreams. Among them, Yahiko quickly emerged as the emotional center of the group. Where Nagato was quiet and withdrawn, Yahiko was passionate and determined. Where Nagato often focused on suffering, Yahiko focused on possibility. He possessed a natural charisma that inspired others to believe change was possible. In many ways, Yahiko became the person Nagato wished he could be. The influence Yahiko had on Nagato cannot be overstated. During these years, Nagato still believed genuine peace could be achieved through understanding. He still believed people could overcome hatred. He still believed the future might be different from the past. Then, Jiraiya entered their lives. The legendary Sannin stayed behind after a war and trained the three orphans, teaching them not only how to survive, but also how to believe in themselves. Jiraiya saw potential in them. He saw kindness. He saw hope. Most importantly, he saw something special in Nagato, the Rinnegan. To Jiraiya, Nagato represented the possibility of change. The prophecy he had spent years searching for seemed to point toward this quiet boy from the Rain Village. Perhaps Nagato would be the one to bring peace to the world. For a time, it genuinely seemed possible. Years passed. The children grew older. Inspired by Yahiko's vision, they founded the original Akatsuki. This version of the organization looked nothing like the one Naruto would eventually encounter. It was not a criminal group. It was not a gathering of rogue shinobi hunting tailed beasts. It was a peace movement. Yahiko believed ordinary people could stand against endless warfare. He believed cooperation could replace conflict. He believed the cycle of hatred could finally be broken. And Nagato believed in Yahiko. That belief sustained him for years. Looking back, this period is perhaps the happiest chapter of Nagato's life. He was surrounded by people he cared about. He was working toward a meaningful goal. He had purpose, friendship, and hope. Then everything collapsed. Hanzo of the Salamander, fearful of the Akatsuki's growing influence, conspired with Danzo to eliminate them. Their plan culminated in a brutal trap designed to force an impossible choice. Nagato was captured. Konan was captured. And Yahiko was forced into a situation where someone he loved would die, no matter what he chose. The moment that followed changed the course of Naruto's history. Rather than allow Nagato to sacrifice himself, Yahiko took control of the situation. He drove himself onto Nagato's kunai, ending his own life. For a few seconds, everything stood still. Then, something inside Nagato broke. Not weakened, not damaged, broken. The person who had represented hope, peace, and a better future was suddenly gone. The dream they built together died alongside him. And just as Obito's worldview collapsed when Rin died, Nagato's worldview collapsed when Yahiko died. The difference is what happened afterward. Obito concluded reality itself was flawed. Nagato concluded humanity would never willingly choose peace. The lesson he took from Yahiko's death was devastatingly simple. No matter how noble the goal, someone stronger would eventually use violence to crush it. Kindness alone could not stop suffering. Good intentions alone could not stop war. If people refused to understand one another through compassion, then perhaps they would understand through pain. That idea became the foundation of pain's philosophy. Over time, Nagato began believing that suffering was humanity's greatest teacher. People only understood loss after experiencing it. They only appreciated peace after enduring tragedy. They only learned empathy after feeling pain themselves. The boy who once wanted to create peace through understanding slowly transformed into a man who wanted to create peace through fear. And in his mind, this wasn't a betrayal of Yahiko's dream. It was the only way to achieve it. That is what makes Nagato such a fascinating villain. He never stops pursuing peace. His destination remains the same from beginning to end. The thing that changes is his understanding of how peace can be reached. The hopeful orphan who followed Yahiko believed people could learn to love one another. Pain believed people could only learn after suffering enough. And somewhere between those two beliefs lies one of the saddest stories in Naruto. Because Nagato did not abandon his dream. He simply lost faith in humanity's ability to achieve it without first experiencing the very pain that had consumed him. Madara Uchiha spent his entire life searching for peace. That may sound strange when speaking about the man who nearly ended the world. But understanding Madara begins with understanding this contradiction. Unlike villains who seek power for its own sake, Madara genuinely believed he was saving humanity. The problem was that every experience in his life convinced him that people were incapable of escaping conflict on their own. By the time Naruto takes place, Madara is remembered almost like a force of nature rather than a person. His name carries the weight of legend. Entire generations grow up hearing stories about his strength. Shinobi speak of him with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Even among history's greatest warriors, he stands apart. Yet long before he became the ghost haunting the shinobi world, Madara was simply a boy born into an age of endless war. To understand why he chose his path, it is important to understand the world he grew up in. The era before the hidden villages was brutally different from the world most Naruto characters know. Clans fought constantly. Children were sent to battlefields at ages that seem unimaginable. Death was not an occasional tragedy. It was an expected part of life. For young Madara, war was not something that happened far away. War was life itself. One of the most fascinating aspects of Madara's childhood is that he did not begin as someone who loved conflict. In fact, quite the opposite was true. Like many children born into violence, he dreamed about a future where fighting would finally end. He wanted stability. He wanted safety. He wanted a world where children would not have to bury their brothers before reaching adulthood. These dreams became even stronger after meeting Hashirama Senju. Without knowing each other's identities, the two boys formed an unlikely friendship beside a river. Both had lost siblings. Both were exhausted by war. Both secretly wished for a better future. In many ways, they were mirror images of one another. Those meetings are among the most important moments in Naruto's history because they reveal who Madara originally was. When he speaks with Hashirama, there is no hatred in him, no obsession with domination, no desire for revenge. There is only hope. For a brief period, it seemed possible that their generation might finally accomplish something previous generations never could. Then, reality intervened. When Madara and Hashirama discovered they belonged to enemy clans, their friendship immediately became more complicated. The Uchiha and Senju were locked in one of the bloodiest conflicts of the era. Both sides had lost countless family members. Both sides carried decades of hatred. As the years passed, the war consumed more of their lives. Madara lost brother after brother. Each death left another scar. Each funeral hardened him a little more. Each battle reinforced the belief that peace remained frustratingly out of reach. This gradual accumulation of loss is crucial to understanding his psychology. Madara's worldview did not collapse in a single moment the way Obito's did. Instead, it eroded slowly over years of disappointment and grief. Every time he reached for peace, war seemed to pull it further away. Eventually, however, something remarkable happened. Madara and Hashirama succeeded where generations before them had failed. Together, they ended the conflict between their clans and founded Konohagakure. At first glance, this should have been the happy ending to Madara's story. The dream had become reality. The village represented everything he and Hashirama once imagined beside that river. Children would no longer need to fight endless wars. Families could live without constant fear. A new era had begun. Yet this is where one of Madara's defining flaws emerged. Unlike Hashirama, Madara struggled to trust what he had built. Even during Konoha's earliest days, he remained deeply suspicious of the future. He worried about how the Uchiha would be treated. He worried that old prejudices would survive beneath the surface. He worried that peace itself was more fragile than people realized. At first, these concerns were not entirely unreasonable. Many members of the village still carried scars from years of conflict. Distrust did not disappear overnight. Political tensions remained. Old rivalries lingered beneath the surface. The difference was that Hashirama viewed these problems as challenges to overcome. Madara viewed them as proof that peace was already failing. This distinction would eventually define their entire relationship. One of the most overlooked aspects of Madara's story is how often he becomes trapped by his own expectations. He wants certainty in a world that cannot provide it. He wants guarantees that conflict will never return. He wants permanent solutions to inherently human problems. But peace is not permanent. It requires constant effort. Hashirama understood this. Madara never fully accepted it. As time passed, his isolation grew. The village increasingly supported Hashirama's vision while moving away from Madara's. Decisions were made without him. Trust eroded. The future he helped create began feeling less like his own. This experience reinforced a belief that had been growing inside him for years. Human beings would always find reasons to divide themselves. Even after achieving peace, they would eventually return to conflict. Eventually, Madara left Konoha entirely. This decision represents a major turning point because it marks the moment he stops trying to improve reality and starts looking for a way to replace it. His final battle against Hashirama at the Valley of the End often receives attention because of its scale, but the emotional significance matters even more. Two men who once shared the same dream now stood on opposite sides of history. Hashirama still believed people could learn. Madara no longer did. When Madara survived that battle and discovered the secrets that would eventually lead to the infinite Tsukuyomi, his worldview crystallized completely. He became convinced that conflict was not an accident of history. It was an unavoidable feature of human existence. People desired different things. People competed. People feared loss. People sought power. As long as human beings remained human, suffering would continue. This conclusion led him toward the infinite Tsukuyomi. Unlike Obito, who embraced the plan after losing faith in reality because of personal tragedy, Madara arrived at the same destination through decades of observation. He studied history. He experienced war. He watched peace fail repeatedly. Over time, he convinced himself that free will itself was the problem. Few characters in anime are more difficult to classify than Itachi Uchiha. For years, he appeared to be exactly what everyone believed him to be: a cold-blooded murderer who slaughtered his entire clan, betrayed his village, joined a criminal organization, and psychologically tortured his younger brother without showing a trace of remorse. Everything about him seemed to fit the image of a villain. His actions were horrifying. His reputation was terrifying. Even other powerful shinobi spoke his name with caution. And yet, the deeper Naruto explores his story, the more that image begins to unravel. What makes Itachi fascinating is not simply that he was secretly a good person all along. That interpretation is far too simple for a character like him. The truth is far more uncomfortable. Itachi chose a path that caused immense suffering, fully understanding the consequences, because he became convinced there was no path that did not lead to suffering. His story is not about choosing between good and evil. It is about choosing between terrible options and carrying the burden of that choice alone. To understand why Itachi became who he did, it is important to begin with something that made him different from almost everyone around him. From a very young age, Itachi understood war. Not in the abstract way children hear stories about battles or heroes. He understood it because he witnessed its aftermath directly. One of the most significant moments of his childhood came when his father brought him to a battlefield littered with corpses. The purpose was to show him the reality of the shinobi world, and the experience affected him profoundly. Most children would have looked at the scene and seen death. Itachi looked at it and saw failure. He saw adults creating conflicts that children would eventually inherit. He saw suffering spreading endlessly from one generation to the next. Most importantly, he began asking questions that very few people around him seemed interested in answering. Why did people continue creating wars when everyone involved suffered from them? Why did hatred survive even when nobody truly benefited from it? These questions stayed with him throughout his life. Unlike Naruto, who learned the value of peace through hardship, Itachi became obsessed with peace before most children even understood what peace really meant. He developed a maturity that seemed almost unnatural for his age. Teachers praised his intelligence. Other shinobi recognized his talent immediately. Everything he touched seemed to come easily to him. Yet beneath those accomplishments was an increasing sense of isolation. One of the recurring tragedies in Itachi's story is that he matures too quickly. While other children experience childhood normally, Itachi spends his time worrying about problems far beyond his years. He becomes a prodigy, not only in skill, but also in perspective. The result is that very few people truly understand him. Even within the Uchiha clan, he begins feeling disconnected. At the center of his life stood two groups pulling him in opposite directions. On one side was his clan, increasingly frustrated by its treatment within Konoha, and increasingly willing to consider rebellion. On the other side was the village itself, which Itachi genuinely loved and wanted to protect. Most people never have to choose between family and community on such a scale. Itachi eventually did. As tensions between the Uchiha and Konoha grew, he found himself trapped between two worlds. The clan believed they were being marginalized and watched with suspicion. Many of their concerns were legitimate. Trust between the village leadership and the Uchiha had deteriorated significantly since the Nine Tails attack. Resentment grew year after year until the possibility of a coup no longer seemed impossible. From the village's perspective, the threat was enormous. From the clan's perspective, the frustration was understandable. And right in the middle stood Itachi. This is where his psychology becomes particularly interesting. Unlike many characters, Itachi rarely views situations through the lens of personal loyalty alone. He constantly thinks about consequences, outcomes, and long-term effects. While others focus on immediate grievances, he focuses on what happens afterward. When he looked at the possibility of civil war, he did not see a conflict limited to Konoha. He saw something much larger. He saw villages exploiting weakness. He saw foreign nations intervening. He saw another great war becoming possible. He saw thousands of lives destroyed because one conflict spiraled into another. Whether those fears were completely accurate is difficult to know. But what matters is that Itachi genuinely believed them. That belief shaped every decision that followed. One of the saddest aspects of Itachi's story is that he gradually becomes convinced that no solution exists. Every path seems to end with bloodshed. Every choice appears to require sacrifice. As pressure increases from both the village leadership and the Uchiha clan, the space for peaceful resolution shrinks until it nearly disappears. Then Danzo enters the equation. Danzo understood something important about Itachi. He understood that Itachi's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. His desire to protect people made him vulnerable to impossible choices. If presented with a decision between sacrificing a few lives and risking many more, Itachi would almost always choose the option that minimized overall suffering. The problem is that real life rarely presents those choices so cleanly. Eventually, Itachi is forced into the decision that would define his legacy forever. The Uchiha massacre remains one of the most controversial events in Naruto because it raises questions that have no comfortable answers. Was there truly no alternative? Could something else have been attempted? Did the village fail the Uchiha long before the situation reached that point? Reasonable people can debate those questions endlessly. What cannot be debated is the emotional cost. On the night of the massacre, Itachi destroyed his own life alongside his clan. He sacrificed his reputation, his relationships, and any chance of happiness he might have had. He accepted becoming a villain in the eyes of the world because he believed it would prevent an even greater tragedy. The one person he could not bring himself to kill was Sasuke. That detail reveals more about Itachi than almost anything else. For all his talk of logic and necessity, his love for his younger brother remained stronger than his ability to follow through completely. Sasuke became the final piece of humanity Itachi refused to surrender. Yet even that love became twisted by the path he chose. Instead of telling Sasuke the truth, Itachi decided to make himself the target of Sasuke's hatred. He believed hatred would keep Sasuke alive. He believed revenge would make him stronger. He believed becoming the villain in his brother's story was a sacrifice worth making. This decision reveals one of Itachi's most tragic flaws. Despite all his intelligence, he repeatedly underestimates the emotional consequences of isolation. He carries burdens alone because he believes doing so protects others. Again and again, he chooses secrecy over trust, believing that suffering in silence is somehow noble. In reality, those choices create new wounds. Sasuke spends years consumed by revenge. The village continues living with lies. Itachi himself becomes increasingly isolated, moving through life as a criminal, while carrying secrets nobody else understands. And yet, despite all of this, he never abandons the belief that he is protecting something larger than himself. That is why Itachi chose his path. Not because he stopped caring about people, but because he cared so much that he eventually convinced himself he could bear every burden alone. In trying to save everyone from suffering, he accepted becoming the source of suffering for the person he loved most. creating one of anime's most tragic examples of a man whose greatest virtues slowly became the reason for his downfall. Akaza did not become a villain because he wanted power. He became a villain because he could not survive his grief. That distinction matters because, unlike many antagonists who pursue domination, revenge, or control, Akaza's story is ultimately about loss. Every terrible thing he does as a demon can be traced back to a single emotional wound that never healed. The tragedy of Akaza is not that he stopped caring about people. It is that he lost the people he cared about most and never found a way to live with the pain afterward. When viewers first meet Akaza, he appears almost straightforward compared to many other demons. He is aggressive, confident, and obsessed with combat. He speaks constantly about strength and seems to measure human worth almost entirely through fighting ability. During his battle with Rengoku, he repeatedly urges the flame Hashira to become a demon, unable to understand why someone so powerful would willingly accept death. At first glance, this can make him seem arrogant. But beneath that obsession lies something much deeper. To understand why Akaza chose his path, it is necessary to go back long before he became Upper Rank 3, before Muzan, before demonhood, and even before he was known as Akaza at all. His original name was Hakuji, and Hakuji's life began with suffering. Unlike many children, he never had the luxury of innocence. Poverty dominated his early years. His mother was sick, his father was absent, and survival itself became a daily struggle. As a child, he turned to theft repeatedly, not because he enjoyed it, but because he was desperate. Every coin he stole was another chance to help his dying father. Every risk he took was motivated by the hope that he might somehow save the only family he had left. The world responded harshly. Again and again, Hakuji was beaten, punished, and branded as a criminal. Adults looked at him and saw a delinquent. They saw a troublemaker. Very few bothered asking why he kept stealing in the first place. One of the saddest details in his story is that even during this period, Hakuji's actions were motivated by love rather than selfishness. His methods were wrong, but his intentions remained painfully human. He was a child desperately trying to hold together a life that was already falling apart. Then came the first devastating loss. His father took his own life. The reason was heartbreaking. He could no longer bear watching his son destroy himself trying to support him. Rather than continue being a burden, he chose death. In a note left behind, he expressed a simple wish: that Hakuji would stop sacrificing his future for someone who could no longer be saved. For most people, losing a parent would be enough to break them. For Hakuji, it was only the beginning. Afterward, he wandered through life carrying immense anger and loneliness. The world had taken everything from him, and he responded the only way he knew how: through violence. He fought constantly. He lashed out. He challenged anyone who stood in his way. Beneath the aggression was a young man who no longer believed life had much to offer him. Then he met Kizo. This encounter changed everything. Keizo was a martial arts master who should have viewed Hakuji as nothing more than a violent delinquent. Instead, he saw something else. He saw pain. He saw potential. Most importantly, he saw someone worth saving. For the first time in years, Hakuji encountered genuine kindness. Keizo welcomed him into his dojo. He gave him purpose. He gave him structure. He treated him not as a criminal, but as a person capable of becoming something better. Slowly, the anger that had defined Hakuji's life began fading. And then there was Koyuki. If Keizo gave Hakuji direction, Koyuki gave him a future. She was gentle, kind, and physically fragile due to illness, yet she became the emotional center of his world. Unlike many people he had encountered throughout his life, she never judged him for his past. She saw the person he was becoming, rather than the mistakes he had made. For perhaps the first time ever, Hakuji was genuinely happy. Looking back, this period is crucial because it reveals the life Akaza truly wanted. He did not dream of becoming powerful. He did not seek immortality. He did not crave endless battles. He wanted a quiet life. He wanted to protect the people he loved. He wanted to marry Koyuki and build a future beside her. The tragedy is that he came incredibly close to achieving it. Then, everything was taken away. A rival dojo, consumed by jealousy and resentment, poisoned the well supplying water to Keizo's dojo. The attack killed both Keizo and Koyuki. In a single day, Hakuji lost his family for the second time. What followed was pure rage. Unlike his earlier anger, which had been born from frustration and hardship, this rage was absolute. Hakuji hunted down everyone responsible and killed them with his bare hands. Years of discipline, kindness, and healing vanished beneath overwhelming grief. This moment is the turning point of his life, not because he became evil, but because he stopped believing there was any reward for goodness. The world had given him hope and then ripped it away. It had allowed him to build a future only to destroy it before it could begin. Every time happiness seemed within reach, suffering followed shortly afterward. When Muzan eventually found him, Hakuji was emotionally shattered. And that is exactly why Muzan succeeded. Many of the greatest villains in Demon Slayer are people encountered at the lowest point of their lives. Muzan rarely creates monsters from happy, fulfilled individuals. He finds broken people and offers them escape. For Hakuji, demonhood offered something incredibly tempting. It offered an end to weakness. No more helplessness. No more watching loved ones die. No more powerlessness. Over time, Hakuji became Akaza, and one particular belief began consuming him completely. Strength became everything. If he had been stronger, perhaps his father could have lived. If he had been stronger, perhaps Keizo and Koyuki could have been protected. If he had been stronger, perhaps none of his suffering would have happened at all. The flaw in this logic is obvious from the outside. strength was never the real problem. But grief rarely behaves rationally. For centuries, Akaza chased power because power felt easier to understand than loss. Every battle distracted him from painful memories. Every victory reinforced the illusion that strength could somehow fill the emptiness inside him. Yet despite everything, traces of Hakuji never disappeared completely. This is why Akaza refuses to kill women. It is why he respects strong opponents. It is why he continually offers powerful humans the chance to become demons, rather than simply slaughtering them. Beneath the monster remains a broken man, trying desperately to preserve fragments of values he can barely remember. That hidden humanity becomes impossible to ignore during his final battle. When his memories eventually return, Akaza realizes something devastating. The strength he spent centuries pursuing was never what he truly wanted. The thing he had been searching for all along was the life he lost beside Keizo and Koyuki. A simple life, a peaceful life, a human life. And that realization explains why Akaza chose his path. Not because he loved violence, but because violence became the only language he knew after grief took everything else away. In the end, Upper Rank 3 was not defeated by a stronger opponent alone. He was defeated by the memories he spent centuries trying to outrun, finally remembering that before he became a demon obsessed with strength, he was simply a man who wanted to protect the people he loved and could never forgive himself for failing to do so. Kokushibo did not choose his path because he hated his brother. He chose it because he could never stop comparing himself to him. That difference is important because many people remember Kokushibo as a villain consumed by jealousy. And while that is certainly true, jealousy alone does not explain the tragedy of his life. Countless people feel envy at some point. Very few allow it to shape centuries of existence. What transformed Michikatsu Tsugikuni into Upper Rank 1 was not a single moment of resentment. It was a lifetime spent standing beside someone who seemed impossibly extraordinary. Among all the villains in Demon Slayer, Kokushibo may be the most human in one particular way. He feared being forgotten. Before he became a demon, before he became the strongest of the upper moons, before he wielded terrifying techniques capable of overwhelming Hashira, he was simply Michikatsu Tsugikuni, a samurai born during the Sengoku era. From the moment of his birth, his life was tied to that of his younger twin brother, Yoriichi. And from the moment Yoriichi revealed his talent, everything changed. In the world Michikatsu grew up in, twins were often viewed with suspicion. Superstition surrounded them. Expectations weighed heavily upon them. As the older brother, Michikatsu was raised to inherit responsibility and status. Yoriichi, quiet and seemingly ordinary, existed largely in the background, at least at first. The irony that would define Michikatsu's entire life is that he began as the gifted one. He received training. He received attention. He received opportunities. Yoriichi did not. Yet despite all of that, it eventually became clear that Yoriichi possessed something nobody else could understand. Talent. Not ordinary talent, not even extraordinary talent. Something far beyond either of those descriptions. One day, Yoriichi picked up a sword for the first time and effortlessly accomplished something trained warriors could not. It was the kind of moment that changes the way people see the world. The rules everyone assumed were fixed, suddenly, no longer applied. For most people, witnessing such a thing would inspire admiration. For Michikatsu, it inspired something much more complicated. At first, he loved his brother deeply. This is one of the most overlooked parts of Kokushibo's story. People often reduce their relationship to simple jealousy, but that is not how it began. Michikatsu genuinely cared for Yoriichi. He admired him. He protected him. There were moments where he looked at his younger brother with affection rather than resentment. The tragedy is that both emotions eventually became impossible to separate. As they grew older, Michikatsu devoted himself to mastering the sword. He trained relentlessly. He sacrificed comfort. He pursued excellence with absolute dedication. Yet no matter how much effort he invested, Yoriichi remained impossibly ahead. The gap between them never closed. In fact, it seemed to grow larger. This is where the psychological foundation of Kokushibo's downfall begins. Human beings can accept failure surprisingly well when they believe improvement is possible. What becomes much harder to accept is realizing that someone else possesses something you can never obtain, no matter how hard you work. Michikatsu was not weak. Far from it. By any normal standard, he was exceptional. The problem was that he spent his life comparing himself to someone who was not normal. Every achievement felt smaller beside Yoriichi. Every victory felt incomplete. Every accomplishment carried the shadow of comparison. Over time, admiration slowly transformed into envy. What made this process especially painful was that Yoriichi never treated him as inferior. Quite the opposite. Yoriichi loved and respected his brother throughout his life. He never mocked him, never belittled him, never acted superior. Yet somehow, that almost made things worse, because it meant Michikatsu could not even direct his frustration toward cruelty or arrogance. The problem existed entirely within himself. Then came the Demon Slayer core. When Yoriichi introduced breathing techniques and revolutionized swordsmanship, countless warriors benefited. Entire generations became stronger because of his influence. Among them was Michikatsu himself. For a brief period, it seemed possible that the brothers might finally walk the same path. But another cruel realization awaited him. Even among demon slayers, Yoriichi remained unreachable. No matter how much Michikatsu improved, his brother remained the standard against which everyone else was measured. Then, the Demon Slayer mark appeared. At first, it seemed like a blessing. The mark granted extraordinary power and allowed warriors to fight at levels previously thought impossible. Yet it carried a terrible price. Those who awakened it rarely lived beyond the age of 25. For most people, This revelation inspired fear. For Michikatsu, it inspired desperation. Because for the first time, mortality became impossible to ignore. He had spent years chasing his brother's greatness. Now, time itself threatened to run out before he could ever reach it. This fear is central to understanding why he chose demonhood. Many villains seek immortality because they fear death. Michikatsu feared something slightly different. He feared dying incomplete. He feared reaching the end of his life and realizing he had never become the person he wanted to be. When Muzan appeared and offered another path, the temptation proved overwhelming. Demonhood promised more time, more years to improve, more opportunities to surpass his limits, more chances to finally stand beside Yoriichi as an equal. From a certain perspective, Michikatsu's decision almost makes sense. If someone has dedicated their entire existence to mastery, how tempting would immortality become? How difficult would it be to walk away from centuries of potential growth? The tragedy is that the very thing he sought became impossible the moment he accepted it. By becoming a demon, he abandoned the humanity that gave his ambitions meaning in the first place. Over the centuries, Michikatsu became Kokushibo. He grew stronger than nearly every demon slayer in history. He mastered techniques beyond imagination. He earned the position of upper rank 1. Yet despite all that power, he never achieved the thing he truly wanted. Because Yoriichi remained Yoriichi. Even as an old man standing at death's doorstep, Yoriichi was still capable of terrifying him. One of the most powerful moments in Demon Slayer occurs when the brothers meet for the final time. Yoriichi is ancient. His body is failing. Death is only moments away. And yet, Kokushibo still cannot defeat him. The realization is devastating. After centuries of sacrifice, centuries of training, centuries of abandoning everything that once made him human, he remains trapped beneath the same shadow. That moment reveals a painful truth. Kokushibo's real enemy was never Yoriichi. It was comparison, the habit of measuring his worth against someone else's greatness, the belief that being extraordinary was meaningless unless he was the most extraordinary. The inability to appreciate what he had because he was obsessed with what he lacked. By the time of his final battle against the modern demon slayers, Kokushibo possesses everything he once thought he wanted: immense power, immortality, respect, fear, status. Yet he is profoundly unhappy, because none of those things solved the emptiness inside him. And when he finally sees his reflection during his last moments, covered in eyes and transformed into something barely recognizable, the truth becomes unavoidable. He sacrificed everything: his family, his humanity, his identity, his peace. And after centuries of chasing perfection, he had become someone his younger self would no longer recognize. That is why Kokushibo chose his path, not because he wanted evil, power, or destruction, but because he spent his entire life looking upward at someone else's greatness instead of appreciating his own. In the end, Upper Rank 1 was not defeated simply by stronger opponents. He was defeated by the realization that no amount of power could cure a soul that had spent hundreds of years searching for validation in the shadow of another man. Eren Yeager did not choose his path because he suddenly became a different person. He chose it because the thing he wanted most in life slowly transformed into something dangerous. From the very beginning of Attack on Titan, Eren is defined by a single idea: freedom. Long before Titans destroyed his home, long before he learned the truth about the world, and long before anyone considered him a threat, he was already obsessed with the idea of living without walls. While most people accepted their lives inside the safety of the cities, Eren could never understand how they were content. He looked at the massive barriers surrounding humanity and saw a cage. He looked beyond them and imagined a world full of possibilities. At first, this dream seems innocent. He wants adventure. He wants to see the ocean. He wants to experience the world that Armin reads about in his books. More than anything, he wants the freedom to choose his own future rather than having it dictated by fear. Everything changes when the colossal Titan appears. The destruction of Shiganshina becomes the defining moment of Eren's childhood. His home is destroyed, thousands die, and his mother is killed in front of him while he stands powerless to stop it. The experience leaves a wound that never truly heals. From that day forward, his dream of freedom becomes inseparable from his hatred of the Titans. For years, his goal feels simple. If the Titans are destroyed, humanity will finally be free. If the enemy is defeated, peace can begin. Like many people in the series, Eren believes the world is divided into clear categories. There are victims and aggressors. There are heroes and monsters. There are people worth protecting and enemies standing in the way. The tragedy is that almost everything he believes turns out to be incomplete. As the story progresses, the truth becomes more complicated with every revelation. The Titans are not mindless creatures from another world. The history taught inside the walls is largely false. The enemies humanity fears are connected to them in ways nobody imagined. Each discovery forces Eren to reconsider everything he thought he understood. Most characters become more hopeful when they gain knowledge. Eren becomes less hopeful. The basement beneath his family's home represents the perfect example of this transformation. For years, it symbolizes answers. It symbolizes progress. It symbolizes the belief that understanding the truth will somehow improve the future. Instead, the truth reveals a world far larger and far more frightening than anyone expected. Beyond the sea exists an entire civilization that views the people of Paradise as monsters. For Eren, this realization changes everything. One of the most important scenes in the series occurs when the survivors finally reach the ocean. Earlier in the story, the ocean feels almost magical. It represents freedom itself. Armin stares at it with wonder because it confirms that the world is bigger than they ever imagined. Eren has a completely different reaction. Instead of celebrating, he looks beyond the water toward the enemies waiting on the other side. While everyone else sees possibility, he sees another battlefield. The dream he carried throughout his childhood suddenly feels farther away than ever. That moment quietly reveals the path he is beginning to follow. The more Eren learns about Marley and the rest of the world, the more he becomes convinced that conflict is unavoidable. Hatred has existed for generations. Entire nations have built their identities around fear and resentment. Even if Paradis survives one threat, another will eventually emerge. The cycle never truly ends. What makes Eren different from most people is that he eventually gains access to knowledge no one else possesses. Through the power of the Attack Titan, he begins seeing fragments of the future. These visions do not provide comfort. They provide certainty. He witnesses events that have not yet occurred and gradually realizes that many of them are connected directly to his own actions. Imagine carrying that burden. Imagine seeing tragedy approaching while also seeing yourself at the center of it. For Eren, this knowledge becomes almost impossible to separate from his identity. The hopeful boy who once believed freedom existed somewhere beyond the horizon slowly starts viewing the future as something fixed and unavoidable. Every new memory seems to push him closer toward a destination he does not fully understand, but cannot stop approaching. Yet even as he changes, one thing remains constant. He never stops caring about his friends. This is what makes his story so tragic. Eren does not become indifferent. He does not stop loving Mikasa, Armin, and the people who stood beside him for years. In many ways, those relationships become the reason for everything that follows. The problem is that he begins valuing their survival above everything else. As his worldview darkens, he reaches a terrifying conclusion. If the outside world intends to destroy Paradise, then Peridot must strike first. If conflict is inevitable, then waiting only increases the danger. If freedom is impossible while enemies remain, then those enemies must be eliminated. That belief eventually leads him toward the rumbling. From the outside, the decision is horrifying. From Eren's perspective, it feels inevitable. He becomes convinced that every alternative ends with the destruction of the people he loves. The future narrows until only one path appears to remain. The cruel irony is that Eren spends his entire life pursuing freedom, only to become trapped by his own understanding of it. The boy who wanted to escape a cage eventually creates a situation where the entire world is forced to live under the shadow of his choices. The dream remains the same, but the methods become unrecognizable. That is why Eren chose his path. Not because he stopped caring about humanity, but because he gradually lost faith in humanity's ability to escape its own cycles of hatred. In trying to protect the future of the people closest to him, he convinced himself that unimaginable destruction was the only remaining road toward freedom, transforming one of anime's most determined heroes into one of its most tragic villains. Meruem did not choose his path because he wanted to become evil. In fact, one of the most fascinating aspects of Hunter x Hunter is that Meruem begins his story as a monster and slowly becomes more human, while many of the humans around him move in the opposite direction. His journey is not about a good person falling into darkness. It is about a creature born at the very top of the food chain, trying to understand what strength, purpose, and value actually mean. When Meruem first enters the story, he views the world through a brutally simple lens. The strong exist to rule. The weak exist to serve. Those incapable of protecting themselves possess no inherent value. To him, this is not cruelty. It is simply reality. From the moment of his birth, Meruem is different from every other chimera ant. He emerges into the world already possessing overwhelming power, while other beings spend years developing their identities through experience. Meruem begins life believing he already understands everything important. His intelligence surpasses almost everyone around him. His physical abilities are beyond comprehension. His aura alone inspires terror. Because of this, he develops an enormous sense of certainty. The world appears simple to him. Power determines worth. Strength determines authority. The strong shape history, while the weak are shaped by it. At first, there is very little reason for him to question these beliefs. Everywhere he looks, the evidence seems to support them. Humans wage wars, exploit one another, and organize societies around power structures that reward strength in various forms. Even before he begins interacting with humanity directly, Meruem observes enough to conclude that domination is the natural order of existence. This perspective becomes obvious in his treatment of others during the early stages of his life. He kills without hesitation. He dismisses lives casually. He views even his own royal guards as tools rather than companions. What makes these moments unsettling is not the violence itself, but the complete absence of malice behind it. Meruem is not angry. He is not sadistic. He simply does not see weaker beings as possessing equal value. In his mind, a king exists above those he rules. And because he was born stronger than everyone else, his position feels self-evident. The turning point of his story arrives through someone who appears completely insignificant: Komugi. At first glance, Komugi should mean nothing to him. She is physically weak, socially awkward, and blind. She possesses none of the qualities Meruem respects. If strength truly determines worth, she should barely register as important. Yet she possesses something he cannot understand. She repeatedly defeats him. Again and again. Despite all his intelligence and confidence, Komugi outplays him in Gungi. What begins as curiosity gradually develops into obsession. For perhaps the first time in his life, Meruem encounters someone who cannot be measured through conventional ideas of strength. This experience destabilizes his worldview. Because if a fragile human can surpass him in something, what else might he be wrong about? As their games continue, Meruem finds himself asking questions he never considered before. Why does Komugi continue playing despite the enormous pressure? Why does she devote herself so completely to a skill that provides no physical power? Why does she show loyalty and sincerity without expecting anything in return? Most importantly, why does he enjoy spending time with her? These questions seem small, but they begin transforming him from the inside. One of the most beautiful aspects of Meruem's story is that his humanity develops gradually rather than suddenly. There is no single moment where he becomes a different person. Instead, countless small interactions slowly chip away at the certainty that once defined him. For the first time, he begins appreciating qualities unrelated to power. For the first time, he begins valuing another individual for reasons beyond usefulness. For the first time, he begins questioning whether strength alone can determine a person's worth. As these changes occur, his understanding of kingship also evolves. Early in his life, he views a king as someone who rules absolutely through superiority. Later, he begins considering a very different idea. Perhaps a king's purpose is not simply to dominate, but to protect. This shift is subtle, but incredibly important. Because once Meruem starts thinking this way, he can no longer see humanity as a collection of inferior creatures. He begins seeing individuals. He begins recognizing complexity. He begins understanding that weakness and value are not the same thing. Ironically, this transformation occurs while the humans hunting him become increasingly willing to abandon their own humanity. No character illustrates this contrast better than Netero. The chairman understands exactly how dangerous Meruem is. He knows that allowing the Chimera Ant King to live could threaten humanity's future. Yet during their confrontation, something fascinating happens. While Meruem attempts to understand humanity, Netero ultimately defeats him through humanity's capacity for destruction. The battle is often remembered for its spectacle, but its philosophical significance is even more important. Meruem enters the fight, believing strength is everything. Netero reveals that humanity possesses something even more dangerous than strength. Human beings possess endless potential for violence. When the poor man's rose detonates, Meruem experiences something completely outside his understanding. He expected a battle between warriors. Instead, he encounters a weapon designed to destroy indiscriminately. In that moment, he learns that humanity's greatest power does not come from physical ability. It comes from ingenuity, desperation, and the willingness to do whatever survival requires. The cruel irony is that by this point, Meruem is already changing. The creature humanity fears most is becoming less monstrous with each passing day. The king who once viewed humans as livestock has started recognizing their dignity. The conqueror who sought domination has begun valuing connection. Yet the momentum of events can no longer be stopped. After surviving the explosion, Meruem gains even greater power. But power is no longer what matters to him. His memories begin returning, and with them comes the realization that only one thing truly matters. Komugi. Not conquest, not rulership, not strength. Komugi. The simplicity of this realization reveals how far he has come. The being who once believed power determined value now chooses to spend his final hours beside a person who possesses none of the qualities he originally respected. Their final scenes together are among the most emotional moments in anime because they represent the completion of Meruem's transformation. He began life convinced that strength made him superior. He ends life understanding that connection gives life meaning. And perhaps that is why Meruem chose his path. Not because he remained the ruthless king introduced at the beginning of the story, but because his journey became a search for understanding. Unlike many villains who descend further into darkness, Meruem spends his life moving toward humanity, slowly discovering that power alone could never answer the questions that truly mattered. By the time he finds those answers, however, there is no time left to build a future around them, leaving behind one of anime's most tragic stories about a king who spent his entire life searching for purpose and only found it at the very end. Griffith did not choose his path because he stopped caring about people. He chose it because he became willing to sacrifice anything for his dream, including the very people who helped him achieve it. Among all the villains in anime, few are as difficult to discuss as Griffith, because his story is built upon a contradiction that exists from the very beginning. On one hand, he is charismatic, intelligent, inspiring, and capable of drawing people toward him almost effortlessly. On the other hand, there is always something distant about him, as though part of his mind is focused on a destination nobody else can fully see. Even during his happiest moments, there is a sense that he belongs more to the future he imagines than to the people standing beside him in the present. That dream defines everything. Long before the Band of the Hawk, before the 100-Year War, and before the eclipse, Griffith was simply a poor child looking up at a castle. The image appears repeatedly throughout Berserk because it represents the foundation of his entire identity. While other children dreamed of surviving another day, Griffith dreamed of something much larger. He wanted a kingdom of his own. He wanted to rise above the circumstances of his birth and create something that would endure long after he was gone. At first, there is nothing inherently wrong with that ambition. In fact, ambition is one of Griffith's most admirable qualities. He refuses to accept the limits imposed by his social status. He refuses to believe that destiny belongs only to the wealthy or powerful. Through intelligence, discipline, and extraordinary charisma, he begins building a path toward the future he envisions. The problem is not the dream itself. The problem is the way Griffith gradually comes to view everything else in relation to that dream. One of the most fascinating aspects of Griffith's character is that he genuinely inspires loyalty. People do not follow him simply because he is successful. They follow him because he makes them believe success is possible. He gives direction to people who previously had none. He creates purpose where there was uncertainty. Under his leadership, the Band of the Hawk grows from a small mercenary group into one of the most respected military forces in the kingdom. At the center of this rise stands Guts. Their relationship is arguably the most important element of Griffith's story, because it exposes parts of his personality that would otherwise remain hidden. When Griffith first encounters Guts, he immediately recognizes something unusual about him. Unlike most people, Guts cannot be easily controlled through charm or promises. He possesses a fierce independence that both attracts and frustrates Griffith. For perhaps the first time in his life, Griffith encounters someone he genuinely wants beside him. This distinction matters because Griffith often speaks about friendship in a very unusual way. Early in the story, he explains that he does not consider someone a true friend unless they pursue a dream equal to his own. At first, this sounds cold, even arrogant. Yet beneath those words lies a revealing truth. Griffith respects ambition because ambition is the language through which he understands the world. The tragedy is that while he admires people who chase their own paths, he also struggles profoundly when they actually do. As the band of the hawk grows stronger, Griffith's dream appears closer than ever. Nobles recognize his talent. Military victories bring prestige. Opportunities that once seemed impossible begin appearing before him. The castle he admired as a child no longer feels unreachable. Yet beneath the success, cracks are beginning to form. One of Griffith's defining characteristics is his need for control. He carefully manages his image, his plans, and the perception others have of him. Most situations unfold according to calculations he has already made. This ability helps him rise through society, but it also creates a dangerous weakness. He becomes dependent on certainty. Then, Guts leaves. Few moments in Berserk are more important than this one, because it reveals how deeply Griffith depended on someone he never fully understood. From Guts's perspective, leaving is an act of growth. He wants to discover his own purpose, rather than living solely as part of someone else's dream. From Griffith's perspective, the departure feels like a betrayal. For perhaps the first time in years, something happens completely outside his control. What follows is one of the most destructive decisions of his life. Emotionally shaken and unable to process the loss properly, Griffith abandons the careful restraint that usually defines him. His actions lead directly to his imprisonment, torture, and eventual downfall. The physical suffering he endures afterward is unimaginable. When he is finally rescued, the Griffith who emerges is no longer the man he once was. His body is broken. His ambitions appear destroyed. The future he spent his entire life pursuing has vanished. This moment is crucial because it places Griffith in a position he has never experienced before: helplessness. Throughout his life, Griffith always moved forward. No matter how difficult the obstacle, there was always another strategy, another opportunity, another step toward his dream. Now there is nothing. The kingdom is gone. The future is gone. The dream is gone. And without the dream, Griffith barely knows who he is. This emotional collapse creates the conditions for the eclipse. One of the reasons the eclipse remains so disturbing is that it forces viewers to confront a terrible question. What would someone sacrifice if achieving their greatest dream required abandoning everything else? Most people like to believe there is a limit. Most people want to think they would refuse. Griffith does not. When offered the chance to become Femto and reclaim the future he lost, he accepts. The decision is horrifying because it is not made in a moment of madness. It is not an accident. It is not a misunderstanding. Griffith understands exactly what is being offered. He understands the cost. He understands who will pay it. And he chooses his dream anyway. What makes this moment so tragic is that the Band of the Hawk was never merely a collection of soldiers. These were people who loved him, trusted him, and devoted their lives to his cause. They helped transform an impossible dream into a reality. Yet when forced to choose between that dream and the people who carried it alongside him, Griffith ultimately reveals which one mattered more. The transformation into Femto does not create his obsession. It simply removes the final barriers, preventing him from acting upon it. That is why Griffith chose his path, not because he lacked humanity, but because he gradually placed his dream above every human connection in his life. The castle he stared at as a child became so important that everything else slowly turned into a stepping stone toward it, until one day he found himself standing before the greatest decision of his life and discovered that he valued the dream more than the people who helped him reach it. Johan Liebert did not choose his path because he wanted power. He chose it because, at some point in his life, he stopped believing that human life had value at all. Among all the villains on this list, Johan is perhaps the most unsettling because his story is not driven by ambition, revenge, jealousy, or even ideology. Most villains want something. They want peace, freedom, recognition, strength, or control. Johan is different. The closer someone looks at him, the more difficult it becomes to identify a traditional goal. Instead, what emerges is a person shaped by abandonment, identity loss, and psychological trauma so profound that it fundamentally altered the way he viewed himself and everyone around him. What makes Johan especially frightening is that he rarely relies on physical strength. He does not overwhelm opponents through combat like Akaza. He does not possess godlike abilities like Madara. He does not command armies through raw power like Griffith. Instead, Johan destroys people through understanding them. He studies fears, insecurities, regrets, and desires, then quietly uses those weaknesses against them until they destroy themselves. To understand why he became this way, it is necessary to begin long before the events of Monster. Johan and his twin sister Anna were born into circumstances that would leave deep psychological scars on both of them. Their earliest years were defined by uncertainty, fear, and manipulation, rather than growing up in a stable environment where they could develop a secure sense of self. They became entangled in systems that treated children as experiments rather than human beings. One of the central themes of Johan's story is identity. Who are you when the people responsible for protecting you instead use you? Who are you when your childhood is shaped by forces beyond your control? Who are you when the adults around you repeatedly send the message that your existence is conditional? These questions haunted Johan from an extremely young age. Throughout Monster, fragments of his past reveal experiences that would deeply affect almost anyone. Institutions such as Kinderheim 511 were not designed to nurture healthy individuals. They were designed to break people down psychologically and reshape them according to specific goals. Children were isolated, manipulated, and subjected to conditions that encouraged emotional detachment and instability. For many children, such environments caused severe damage. For Johan, the effects became something even more complicated. One of the most tragic aspects of his character is that he seems to lose his sense of individuality. Rather than developing a stable identity, he begins viewing himself almost as an empty space. Memories become fragmented. Personal boundaries become blurred. His understanding of who he is grows increasingly uncertain. This uncertainty becomes especially important when examining his relationship with Anna. The twins share experiences that few people could understand, and their bond sits at the center of Johan's psychology. Yet even within this relationship, questions of identity continue appearing. Certain memories become confused. Certain experiences become intertwined. The distinction between self and other begins breaking down in ways that profoundly affect Johan's development. As he grows older, this instability evolves into a deeply pessimistic view of humanity. Unlike villains who lose faith because of one devastating event, Johan's worldview appears to develop through countless experiences reinforcing the same message. Again and again, he witnesses cruelty, selfishness, manipulation, and betrayal. Again and again, adults fail to protect the vulnerable. Again and again, institutions designed to help people instead cause suffering. Over time, he begins reaching a terrifying conclusion. If human beings are capable of such darkness, perhaps human life has no inherent meaning at all. This belief becomes the foundation of everything that follows. One of the reasons Johan is so effective as a villain is that he rarely forces people to do anything. Instead, he identifies thoughts already hiding inside them. He finds loneliness, resentment, fear, or despair, and quietly amplifies those emotions until they consume the individual completely. In many ways, Johan functions less like a traditional antagonist and more like a mirror. People encounter him and begin confronting parts of themselves they desperately wanted to avoid. Some collapse under the pressure. Others commit terrible acts. Others become obsessed with understanding him. This pattern repeats throughout the series because Johan's greatest weapon is not manipulation alone. His greatest weapon is his ability to make people question whether life itself possesses value. At the center of his philosophy lies a particularly disturbing idea. Johan often behaves as though all lives are fundamentally equal because all lives are equally meaningless. Wealth, status, intelligence, success, and power do not impress him because he views death as the great equalizer. No matter who someone is, they eventually disappear. Because of this belief, he becomes fascinated by annihilation. Not necessarily physical destruction alone, but erasure. The disappearance of identity. The disappearance of memory. The disappearance of existence itself. This fascination explains many of his actions throughout Monster. While other villains seek to leave their mark on history, Johan often seems interested in the opposite. He repeatedly gravitates toward the idea of becoming nobody, leaving nothing behind, and erasing every trace of himself. What makes this philosophy tragic, rather than simply evil, is that it grows from profound emotional damage. Johan was not born believing life was meaningless. He was taught that lesson repeatedly by the world around him. Every betrayal reinforced it. Every manipulation reinforced it. Every loss reinforced it. As the years passed, he became increasingly convinced that human beings were incapable of creating the kind of meaning, connection, and compassion necessary to justify existence. This is where Dr. Tenma becomes so important. Throughout the series, Tenma represents everything Johan rejects. While Johan sees meaninglessness, Tenma sees value. While Johan sees corruption, Tenma sees possibility. While Johan believes lives can be discarded, Tenma believes every life matters. Their conflict is not merely a chase between hero and villain. It is a battle between two fundamentally different understandings of humanity. Johan continually tests the limits of Tenma's beliefs, almost as if he wants proof that genuine goodness exists. In some ways, it feels as though part of him is searching for evidence that his worldview is wrong, even while another part works tirelessly to prove it right. That contradiction makes him one of anime's most complex antagonists. Because beneath the manipulation, beneath the murders, and beneath the terrifying calmness, there remains a damaged child who never found a stable answer to the question of who he was supposed to become. That is why Johan chose his path. Not because he desired domination or revenge, but because he gradually lost faith in the idea that human existence possessed meaning at all. The result was a man who moved through the world like a living void, pulling others into the same despair that consumed him, while searching for an answer to questions that had haunted him since childhood, and never finding one capable of filling the emptiness inside him. Sosuke Aizen did not choose his path because he wanted to destroy the world. He chose it because he could not accept living beneath someone he believed was fundamentally unworthy of ruling it. Among all the villains in Bleach, Aizen stands apart because his motivations are not rooted in tragedy, heartbreak, or personal loss. Unlike Obito, Nagato, or Akaza, there is no defining moment where the world breaks him. There is no childhood trauma that explains everything. There is no catastrophic event that transforms him from a good person into a villain. Instead, Aizen's story is about pride, intellect, and isolation. More specifically, it is about what happens when someone becomes so intelligent and capable that they gradually lose the ability to respect the systems governing them. When viewers first meet Aizen, he appears calm, polite, and almost unusually kind. Compared to many of the stronger personalities within the Soul Society, he seems approachable. He avoids unnecessary conflict. He speaks softly. He appears more interested in understanding others than controlling them. Looking back, one of the most impressive aspects of his character is how completely this image succeeds. For years, both the audience and the characters around him accept the version of Aizen he presents. They see a loyal captain, a respected leader, and a thoughtful individual who rarely seeks attention. The reality hiding beneath that image is entirely different. The truth is that Aizen had already begun questioning the structure of the world long before the story started. To understand why he chose his path, it is important to understand one of his defining traits. Aizen is almost never the smartest person in the room. He is usually the smartest person in the entire building. This level of intelligence creates a unique form of isolation. While many characters struggle because they lack power, Aizen struggles because he possesses too much of it. His understanding of the world allows him to see flaws, contradictions, and weaknesses that most people never notice. Over time, this perspective begins separating him from everyone around him. The more he learns about the Soul Society, the less respect he has for it. At first glance, the Soul Society appears noble. It maintains order. It protects souls. It preserves balance between worlds. Most Shinigami dedicate their lives to serving these goals. Aizen sees something else. He sees a system built on hidden truths. He sees leaders following rules they barely understand. He sees an entire society structured around obedience rather than genuine understanding. Most importantly, he discovers the existence of the Soul King. This revelation becomes one of the most important factors in his development because it fundamentally changes the way he views authority. The Soul King is supposedly the foundation upon which reality itself is built. Countless institutions derive legitimacy from his existence. The balance of the world depends upon him. Yet when Aizen learns the truth, he is horrified. Rather than a divine ruler guiding existence, the Soul King is essentially a powerless figure maintained by the system around him. To Aizen, this realization exposes what he considers the greatest weakness in the entire structure of reality. The being standing at the top is not truly ruling. The being standing at the top is simply being used. This idea becomes impossible for him to accept. One of Aizen's defining beliefs is that power and authority should be connected. In his mind, those who possess the greatest understanding and capability should shape the future. The idea that reality itself rests upon what he views as a hollow foundation feels absurd. Many people would react to such a discovery with disappointment. Aizen reacts with ambition, because once he loses respect for the system, he begins asking a dangerous question. If the current ruler is unworthy, why shouldn't someone else take that position? This question gradually evolves into the core of his philosophy. Unlike villains motivated by destruction, Aizen does not want chaos. He wants control. He wants order. He wants a world shaped by someone he considers competent. The problem is that the only person he truly views as competent enough for that role is himself. This is where his arrogance becomes inseparable from his vision. To be fair, Aizen's confidence is not entirely unfounded. Throughout Bleach, he consistently demonstrates extraordinary intelligence, patience, and strategic ability. He manipulates events decades in advance. He orchestrates conflicts with remarkable precision. He repeatedly outmaneuvers opponents who should have every advantage. The success of these plans reinforces his belief that he is different from everyone else. And once someone begins believing they are fundamentally superior, it becomes increasingly difficult for them to see others as equals. One of the most fascinating aspects of Aizen's character is that despite constantly surrounding himself with followers, he rarely forms genuine connections. The Espada serve him. His allies obey him. His subordinates respect him. Yet very few people actually know him. This emotional distance exists because Aizen rarely views relationships the same way other characters do. Most people seek companionship, understanding, or trust. Aizen seeks usefulness. He evaluates people according to what role they can play within a larger plan. As a result, he spends much of his life alone, despite never physically being alone. That isolation grows alongside his ambition. The more successful he becomes, the more convinced he becomes that nobody can truly challenge him. Every victory confirms his worldview. Every successful manipulation reinforces the belief that he understands reality better than everyone around him. Then he meets resistance. Not merely physical resistance, but philosophical resistance. Characters like Ichigo represent something Aizen struggles to understand. Ichigo gains strength through connections with others. He grows through loyalty, friendship, and mutual trust. His power emerges not from standing above people, but from standing beside them. This directly contradicts Aizen's worldview. Aizen believes superiority creates greatness. Ichigo proves that connection can create greatness as well. This clash becomes increasingly important as the story progresses, because it exposes a flaw at the center of Aizen's philosophy. For all his intelligence, he consistently underestimates the value of human relationships. He understands strategy, power, and manipulation better than almost anyone. What he struggles to understand is why people willingly sacrifice for one another without expecting anything in return. By the time his plans begin unraveling, Aizen has already achieved things most people would consider impossible. He transcends traditional limitations. He acquires extraordinary power. He comes closer than almost anyone to reshaping reality itself. Yet despite all of that, something remains missing. The respect and understanding he spent his life pursuing never truly arrive. Because deep down, Aizen's story is not only about ambition, it is about loneliness. A loneliness created by viewing himself as separate from everyone around him. A loneliness created by believing that nobody could possibly understand him. A loneliness created by placing himself above humanity for so long that he eventually lost the ability to stand alongside it. That is why Aizen chose his path, not because he wanted destruction, revenge, or suffering, but because he became convinced that the world was being governed by an unworthy system, and that only someone with his intelligence and vision could correct it. In chasing that belief, he gradually elevated himself above everyone else, until the gap between himself and humanity became so large that he could no longer recognize the very qualities that gave meaning to the people he looked down upon. Light Yagami did not choose his path because he wanted to become a god. He chose it because, at some point, he became convinced that justice could not exist in a world governed by flawed human beings. Among all the villains in Death Note, Light is perhaps the most unsettling because his descent does not begin with hatred, trauma, or instability. It begins with intelligence. He is already exceptional long before he ever finds the Death Note. He is the top student in Japan, disciplined, analytical, and deeply aware of the gap between how the world should function and how it actually functions. Even as a teenager, he is not satisfied with surface-level explanations of morality. He constantly evaluates systems, structures, and outcomes with a kind of cold precision that sets him apart from his peers. When he first discovers the Death Note, his reaction is not immediate chaos or confusion. Instead, it is curiosity, followed by experimentation, and then quickly followed by control. The moment he confirms the notebook's power, something shifts inside him, not because he suddenly becomes evil, but because he finally encounters a tool that matches his already existing dissatisfaction with the world. At first, his intentions are easy to rationalize. He tells himself he is removing criminals. He tells himself he is creating fear to reduce crime. He tells himself he is building a better world. And at the beginning, there is even a brief sense that something positive might come from it. Crime rates drop, violence decreases. People begin speaking about Kira as if he is a force of nature rather than a person. From a purely statistical perspective, his actions appear to produce results. But what makes Light's story so compelling is how quickly morality becomes secondary to control. As he continues using the Death Note, the original idea of justice slowly evolves into something more personal. Every investigation into Kira becomes a threat. Every detective becomes an obstacle. Every disagreement becomes justification for escalation. The line between eliminating criminals and eliminating opposition gradually disappears. Light does not simply want a safer world anymore. He wants a world where his judgment cannot be questioned. One of the most important aspects of his character is how naturally he adapts to each new step. There is no sudden jump from idealism to tyranny. Instead, each action logically follows the last one, at least from his perspective. If killing criminals is justified, then killing those who threaten his mission becomes justified. If killing investigators is justified, then manipulating allies becomes justified. If manipulating allies is justified, then sacrificing anyone becomes justified if it protects the greater goal. This gradual expansion of justification is what makes him so dangerous. Because at no point does he feel like he is breaking his own rules. He feels like he is refining them. The introduction of L fundamentally changes the trajectory of the story. For the first time, Light encounters someone who matches his intellect. L does not accept easy answers. He does not rely on authority. He does not assume morality is obvious. Instead, he treats the Kira case as a problem to be solved through logic alone. This creates a rivalry that is not only strategic, but philosophical. Light believes justice is absolute and can be enforced by a single will. L believes justice is relative and must be tested through investigation and doubt. Neither is completely wrong, but neither is willing to compromise. As the investigation intensifies, Light becomes increasingly trapped in his own creation. The Death Note, which once represented control, slowly becomes a source of constant pressure. Every action must be carefully calculated. Every decision risks exposure. Every relationship becomes a potential liability. Yet instead of stepping back, Light leans further in. This is one of the most important aspects of his downfall. At no point does he truly consider stopping. Because stopping would mean admitting that his vision was flawed. Eventually, Light begins to see himself less as a person and more as a symbol. Kira is no longer just an identity he uses. It becomes an ideology, something that exists beyond him. People begin worshiping Kira, fearing Kira, and building beliefs around Kira. This separation between Light and his persona allows him to detach emotionally from increasingly extreme actions. The more successful Kira becomes, the less human Light feels. Relationships suffer as a result. His connection with his family becomes strained. His partnership with Misa becomes manipulative. Even moments of emotional vulnerability are calculated, used as tools rather than genuine expressions of self. What makes this progression especially tragic is that Light still believes he is right. Even as the cost rises, he continues framing every sacrifice as necessary. In his mind, the world is improving. Crime is decreasing. Order is increasing. Fear is functioning as intended. From his perspective, the end justifies not only the means, but every escalation that follows. The problem is that absolute control eventually demands absolute opposition. And that opposition comes in the form of Nier and the successor investigation team. Unlike L, who challenged Light directly, Nier approaches the problem with patience and reconstruction. He does not try to match Light emotionally or philosophically. Instead, he studies patterns, reconstructs logic, and slowly closes every remaining gap. By the time Light is cornered, the gap between his vision and reality has become impossible to ignore. Everything he built depends entirely on secrecy. And once secrecy is gone, so is Kira's power. The final moments of Light's story are among the most important in anime, because they strip away every layer he constructed. Without the notebook, without control, without followers, and without manipulation, he is forced to confront the reality of what he became. There is no God complex left in practice, only a human being who pushed his beliefs far beyond the point of sustainability. That is why light chose his path. Not because he wanted destruction for its own sake, but because he became convinced that justice required absolute control and that only he was capable of delivering it. In pursuing that belief, he gradually replaced morality with authority, until the distinction between saving the world and ruling it disappeared entirely, leaving behind a man who could no longer separate his identity from the system he created and ultimately destroyed.